The recordings we have, especially on Deutsche Grammophon, of the major Verdi operas are signature, iconic reference pieces, bar none. I mean, in the modern recording era, without question, what Abbado left us is irreplaceable.
Vi porge pegni di pace ricchi doni e annuncia schiuso le usine alle liguri prore. Acconsentite.
Claudio Abbado conducted this recording of Verdi's Simon Boccanegra with Piero Capuccilli in the title role while he was the music director at La Scala Opera House in Milan. As the baritone Thomas Hampson was saying, he was acclaimed as one of the greatest Verdi master conductors of our time. And he was also, as that great and unique composer was, devoted to making opera available to as many people as possible, be they poor or wealthy. And this was because he passionately felt that opera was a vital art form for all humanity. For his newer and also older audiences at La Scala Opera House and at the Vienna State Opera, where later he was also the music director, and also for the singers who performed with him, Claudio Abbado was a powerful inspiration on many levels. There was his dramatic brilliance in both directing and accompanying all at once, so that there was an ideal mix of individual expression, spontaneous interaction, and yet tight ensemble. There was his natural flair for pacing the theatrical action both flexibly and precisely, so that there was great tension and yet atmosphere. And there was his deep empathy with the different cultures and styles of a very remarkably wide range of repertoire, so that he had an acclaimed command in Russian, French and German operas, as well as Italian works. For Thomas Hampson, and also for the bass Robert Lloyd, this was one of his most vital characteristics.
There are very few, but there's a handful of exquisite Italian musicians who fundamentally understand and respect the difference of musical languages. And I think Abbado completely understood the difference between a Germanic musical language and an Italian musical language and a Russian musical language. He would no more have his Verdi sound like Mussorgsky than he would have his Schubert sound like Mozart.
He had an understanding of the relationship between music and language at a very high level. And quite honestly, in many ways, that's the secret of opera conducting, to have that sense of what the language does for the music, because vocal music always emerges from the language. And the difficulties that singers have is they have to find a way of singing a language that communicates a certain authenticity in that language. And that's very difficult to do if you're an Englishman, I can tell you. But the secret of doing it is to find what it is in that language that has created the music. And I think that was pretty much Claudio's relationship with languages. He understood the relationship between language and music.
Robert Lloyd sang the officer Zuniga in Claudio Abbado's recording of Bizet's Carmen, with Teresa Berganza in the title role, Placido Domingo as Don José, and the London Symphony Orchestra. And here, just as Don José is about to leave Carmen in a fury after they have fallen out, and she has lost her feelings for him, suddenly Zuniga arrives on extremely unofficial business. This is in Lilas Pastias Tavern outside the city of Seville, where the gypsies and Carmen gather together. And Zuniga wants Carmen for what so many of the men in Seville hope they might have from her, or rather with her. When he sees Don José there, he insults him and tells him to get out. Don José draws his sword, but Carmen calls for help from the other gypsies in the tavern, who are all smugglers. and all is set for the remainder of the opera to take its tragic course of Don José deserting the army and ultimately murdering Carmen. It's a short but extremely important little scene, and it needs the most careful dramatic handling of the music, the action and the text by the conductor.
J'ouvre moi-même et j'entre. Affi la belle, le choix n'est pas heureux. C'est ce mes alliés de prendre le soldat quand on a l'officier. Allons, décampe, non! Si fait, tu partiras. Je ne partirai pas. Trop! Allez! Il va pleuvoir d'écho. Les genoux.
Eons away from Bizet's Carmen, another favourite French opera of Claudio Abbado was Claude Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande, conjuring up a half-lit, shadowy and elusively mysterious atmosphere, and yet powerfully telling a deeply realistic story of tragic love within the symbolically evocative environment of an old castle in a forest. Although the opera is set in an ancient time, it could happen right now. A middle-aged man, Golo, falls in love at sight with a much younger woman, Mélisande, willowy, alluring, strangely quiet, and lost. She accepts his offer of marriage, but she soon feels oppressed by his gloomy and heavy character and the claustrophobia of the home where he has brought her to. There seems to be, though, just one ray of light for her there. Golo's younger half-brother, Pelléas, more sensitive and more youthfully impulsive. He is staying there for a while with Golo and Golo's mother and grandfather. Very gradually, Pelléas and Mélisande become attracted to each other and they begin to fall in love. Only they dare not confess it openly, not until in due course they are obliged to do so in a moment of crisis. Instead, their love just grows delicately, but inevitably of its own accord very gradually, while also slowly but inexorably suspicion and jealousy begin to fester in Golo's mind as he senses latent passions that are being aroused between them. But also he doesn't dare confess that openly to himself or to anyone else. It all leads in due course to catastrophe, murder, and then intense remorse. Before that, though, the growing feelings for each other of Pelléas and Mélisande are expressed in some of the very most subtle music that Debussy ever wrote, and most especially so because Mélisande says very little, and indeed throughout the opera, often the greatest power is the suggestion in the music of what is felt privately inside Pelléas and Mélisande and also inside Golo, rather than what might be said openly by the characters. This requires a very special skill indeed from the conductor, every bit as much as it does from the singers.
Oh, qui est là? Moi et moi. Que fais-tu là à la fenêtre en chantant comme un oiseau qui n'est pas d'ici? J'arrange mes cheveux pour la nuit. C'est là ce que je vois sur le mur. Je croyais que tu avais de la lumière. J'ai ouvert la fenêtre. Il fait d'innombrables étoiles.
Singing Mélisande in Claudio Abbado's recording of Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande is the soprano Maria Ewing.
His approach was very subtle, what he did. And he loved the French repertoire. And just an outstanding talent.
Penche-toi un peu, que je vois tes cheveux dénoués. Je suis affreuse ainsi. Oh, oh, Mélisande, oh, tu es belle ainsi. Penche-toi, penche-toi, laisse-moi venir plus près de toi. Je ne puis pas venir plus près de toi. Je me penche tant que je peux. Je ne puis pas monter plus haut. Donne-moi du moins ta main ce soir. Avant que je m'en aille, je pars demain. Si, je partirai demain. Donne-moi ta main, ta petite main sur mes lèvres.
I said before that Pelléas et Mélisande is eons away from Carmen, and it is once again eons away from another tremendously powerful operatic masterwork of a wholly different kind that's sung in the German language, Wozzeck by Alban Berg. An intensely raw and confrontationally realistic portrayal based on a true story of how society abuses and exploits an impoverished and mentally ill, indeed virtually insane soldier, Wozzeck. He is driven to murder his unfaithful mistress after being humiliated and confused by all the destructive experiences he is subjected to. But although Berg's musical and stylistic language is eons away from Debussy's, for Claudio Abbado there was a vital link between Wozzeck, Pelléas et Mélisande, and another very different masterpiece that was also one of his very favourite works, Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov.
I said many years ago in the bridge of the last centuries and this centuries from Mussorgsky to Debussy and Alban Berg, great composer, they are almost just one great opera. And then a second opera that didn't finish. And it was exactly Mussorgsky, Berg and Debussy. And with three completely different culture, but with some connection between the three.
I think one of the most immensely dramatic impressions in any opera performance I have ever heard was achieved by the conducting of Claudio Abbado in the last act of Wozzeck, when he performed it at the Vienna State Opera in 1987 with Franz Grundheber and Hildegard Behrens as Wozzeck and his mistress Marie. And Deutsche Grammophon preserved the live performance in extraordinarily lifelike sound. Wozzeck is with Marie on a lonely path in a wood, and it is dusk. As the dew begins to fall, Wozzeck says to her, "Those who are cold shiver no longer. You won't shiver in the morning dew." "What are you saying?" says Marie. "Nothing." There's a long, long pause as the moon rises, and then, with Abbado's remarkable control, the orchestra just creeps in imperceptibly as Marie says, "How red the moon is." "Like blood-stained steel," says Wozzeck as he draws a knife and slashes her throat. Claudio Abbado put in intensively demanding preparation with the singers and the orchestra for this very highly acclaimed performance of Wozzeck. But, as always, he was in his reserved and self-effacing way, very simple and to the point. And Franz Grundheber, who sang the role of Wozzeck with many conductors, deeply valued his professionalism and his talent.
Abbado, he is not somebody who makes friends around him. He has a distance. He was detached. I loved it. He was always very kind, very friendly, and enjoying, inspiring. And I didn't know about him as a person, anything. But I loved it. The way we were, I was a singer and he was a fantastic conductor. And what else do you want more than a fantastic conductor if you do Wozzeck?
A fantastic conductor. That really is extremely high praise coming from an artist as demanding as Franz Grundheber. And it's borne out also by Thomas Hampson, how Claudio Abbado had an exceptional talent for communicating and directing in his conducting.
When Abbado's conducting, you're just hanging on every fingertip and gesture. Abbado, in his conducting technique, was just a plethora of subtle indications. What that man heard in his imagination, in his ear, what he was hearing while people were making music, was just, for me, an astonishing classroom. And really what a conductor's all about. His particular gestures or gesticulations or beat patterns or whatever all become completely secondary. You knew exactly what context he was looking for that instrument or that singer or that balance that he was looking for in a recording or performance, with some of the most incredibly subtle gestures, just light movements of the hand that were like a chapter in a book. I mean, he was incredibly expressive to artists working with him. I think to the public, they got a lot of that too, but sometimes the public misunderstands or underestimates what a powerful relationship it is to be standing in front of a conductor with a full orchestra and literally divining yourself into an existential experience. And this is something that Abbado was truly extraordinary at.
Astroford, dormi, svegliati, su, ti testa, tu moglie sbarra, e metta in malasetto, guarda tuo, la tua casa, ed il tuo letto.
And here Claudio Abbado is conducting the extremely demanding score of Verdi's Falstaff, with Thomas Hampson singing the role of Ford, consumed with burning jealousy as his plan to trap Falstaff has ended in disaster, as he now believes, completely incorrectly, that Falstaff is seducing his wife. Why is it so demanding for the conductor? Because Verdi introduced a new, quick-fire, fast-changing volatility into the world of opera in this work, and it still poses a great challenge for a conductor to achieve ensemble precision between the singers and the orchestra, and yet create and handle spontaneous, dramatic freedom at the same time. The orchestra here is the Berlin Philharmonic, and in our final podcast, in which we're celebrating the great art and wonderful gifts of Claudio Abbado, we're focusing on his time as the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra's artistic director, and we're also paying tribute to his pioneering work creating and conducting orchestras of young musicians. And also, our contributors to this series will be assessing the lasting value and greatness of Claudio Abbado's overall legacy. That's in the fifth and final podcast of Claudio Abbado, a memoir.